to hear your questions. And so that I heard several comments that if you could speak a little closer to the microphone. So let's go to some substance here. I want you to draw from your expertise or from your own experience about what it takes to get people who have very dramatically diverging views to speak to one another and to listen to one another. One of the most harmful side effects of not communicating with people with opposing views is that it's a lot easier for you to become the victim of an actor who uses that lack of communication to demonize the opposition, and it's very common, and it's easy when people have no communication. So how do we get, in your own experience, people to speak to one another when they have stopped talking to one another because they disagree about everything?
Well, in my own experience, I had someone tell me a long time ago that really we think about they need to speak to me or I need to speak to them. And what I was told is, hey, they don't need you. They don't need to talk to you. You need to put the effort out. Even though it's uncomfortable, you need to put the effort out. And once you put the effort out, and it may go both ways, but usually people will engage. But don't look for somebody speaking to you. You need to engage with people, and especially people that you really might be uncomfortable with to try to do that. And I'll just run from the legislature. I have a great friend who we are totally opposites. He comes from Daniels County, kind of looks like me. And we look alike, but we were on a committee, but we've become great friends because we started talking to each other. And John Brendan is named, and it was very interesting to me, and after we became friends, and I was out of the legislature, and he said, you gotta help me with my wife's birthday party. and I said, what do you mean? And she said, the only thing she wants to do is go and have a tour of Butte. And so they came down and we did, but we did great legislation together, as Clayton will tell you. And the beauty of it was, I would say, John, you guys got the majority. You've got to put this in. You've got to carry it. But it was actually something that I wanted. And he'd say, you got it. But in order to do that, we had to get to a point where we trusted each other. So once you have to break the ice, then you have to get the level of trust.
And does that reflect a different era, or is it something that still can take place nowadays?
Oh, I think it can take place now. I think conflict exists, and just think of it: Spanish-American War, First World War, Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War, Gulf War. We've been in conflict for the entire 150 years. But the only way we can move through all that is to recognize to ourselves to don't get involved in the conflict. And I think social media brings us that conflict so close to us, where if we have good friends, my wife has a friend at the lake, the other party, and they got in a little fight. They got in a big fight. And she came back, and I said, you have to go back, and she did. And you have to put the effort out on those conflicts. I think you always have to look within inside yourself.
Well said, and very rewarding when you make that effort. Dr. Johnson.
There's an academic term called social capital, and that really has been frayed in America. Social media, bowling alone. I mean, the idea is that all those clubs have declined. And there's too many opportunities perhaps now where people can just talk to people who they already agree with and have contempt for the other side. And that works both ways. So building the trust is very important, just as you said, building trust, finding those opportunities to, you don't have to always agree with someone else, but not to always distrust someone else or another group, but to find those opportunities to meet in groups, to talk to people, whether it's through whatever institution, mediating institution, whatever the opportunity is, even just going out, to a coffee shop or a gym. When you meet with people, try to engage them, and I think sometimes even just sort of liking a person or seeing the positives, even if you things you disagree with, try not to hold on to that and try to work through it. If it's a formal disagreement you have that you have to negotiate, try to come to the table, take some time off for yourself if things get heated, and come back when your head is cooler, or my head is cooler, whoever's it might be, to really try to work at it. I mean, really you have to work at it. It takes practice and to work at it. I think this is very important for all of us. Not an easy answer. There's a lot of things working against working against us from always getting together, including advertisements on television or social media. So I think we have to be aware of it and really work to try to try to push against the things that pull us apart.
Thank you, Clayton.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, and I would tend to agree. I mean, there is one element that always helps, and certainly from sort of Jim and I's perspective, having somebody convene us, which is the legislature and the Constitution that says that we have to meet as a legislature and pass a state budget. It means that we have a reason to show up all in the same building and have to at least tolerate each other for 90 days. So it helps that somebody convenes us at that place. But once you're there, I think Jim is exactly right, that you have a choice of whether or not you want to do the work or not. And I have found that, with rare exception, there is not anybody in that building I can't find something in common with. And it might be as simple as that their suit looks really great today. And sometimes you start at the very basic level and you work up. And often, for me, working with those in the majority and untraditional allies, and for a long time when I started this work, because of stream access and because of water law, agriculture and Trout Unlimited could not even sit in the same room together. This last week, I had an entire educational series on water law to the Montana Stock Growers membership. Things change because you find things to work together on, and I think that that's my advice, at least in the context of folks who are trying to work on something in their community or in their state or in their country around a policy matter is, you might show up to the legislature because you really care about X, but you're gonna need somebody's help, probably in the majority, to get that done, or in a coalition to get that done. Many times you gotta start working on Y, which is what they really want. You want X, they want Y, and you put in the effort to help them get what they want accomplished, and you build the trust through that. Even though you might not have a lot of interest in that topic, I think working together, finding something that you can agree on, and doing the work together is how you build that trust. And I think that being solutions oriented is the other way.
Thank you. There is an interesting fact of history, is that if you look at one of the most vicious and bloody period of conflict in history of Europe were the wars of religions for 150 years. And what brought these wars of religion that were just astonishingly murderous to a conclusion was not a change of mentality as much, or a period of enlightenment or improved tolerance of each other. It was pure exhaustion. People could not do it anymore. They were exhausted hating one another. Is there a possibility, because if you look at polls, even though people seem to embrace polarization, most Americans, whom I consider to be very, very decent people, complain about how uncomfortable our current polarization is for them and their families. So could we look for a period of time when people would say, we've had enough of it, we're going to try something else and try to get along better with one another?
Well, this would be my opinion. I think we're getting close to that now. If you watch that television, you can't watch it anymore. And I worry about the younger generation, though, because they don't get their news the way they don't look at anything that I look at. They don't look at anything that I look at, the younger generation. It's social media. And if you go back 20 years, if you lied, that was a big deal. Now you don't know what the truth is. I mean, it's just, you can't figure out truth for it. And in social media, it's you know, and to be quite honest, I have friends that are just tied to social media, and family too. And you go, why are they like that? And that's the part I think is going to be hard to get by. Is to get back to where you say to yourself or people around you, boy, that isn't true. Where now it's one untruth after another, and then the fact check happens, but it's almost like it all goes over your head. I think that's I don't know when we're going to get there, but hopefully we will.
Thank you.
Two examples in history, from the United States history, were the two Red Scares in the United States. They burned really hot, and then they burned themselves out. You saw the movie Oppenheimer. It goes through the second one, certainly. That's when he was pushed out from the game, you know, the secret, being able, because of his past, communist past. But with in both cases, that was essentially a burnout. In the second one, McCarthy was discredited. And even in the first one, eventually we move on to, by the late 1920s, that first one burned out too. So in other words, people got tired of all the, what was happening. And while, you know, there was some discrediting for in the second one for Senator McCarthy, some was just people wanting to move beyond that to other issues. So I certainly think there's a possibility that, I'm not saying we're having, you know, there's never a perfect society, but certainly some of this polarization that we see today could burn stuff out.
Thank you, that's encouraging.
Yeah, I would say one thing that does concern me a bit, and being a more than casual observer to sort of the political discourse, at least in the state of Montana, is a lot of what I have talked about is collaborative process and compromise and being solutions oriented. And my sort of critique of both political parties today is this sort of unwillingness or degradation of people willing to compromise and to give up a little bit to get a little bit. And that's something that's concerning the legislature. It makes it harder to get to sort of majority consensus solutions. That being said, I think when you start looking at issues, and in a contemporary context today, I was working on a water policy issue that has literally been pervasive through my entire career around exempt wells. And I think that we finally, at least most of us, got to the point that we were tired that so-and-so could pass a bill and we would get it vetoed, and so-and-so would introduce a bill and we'd kill that bill. And this has just gone back and forth for decades. And so I do think that there's something to be said for this sort of exhaustion of conflict that can promote a desire to find compromise.
Thank you very much. How much about conflict is genuine passion or concerns over issues, and how much is electoral strategy or just a tool for dominance or exercising political power? Who wants to take that?
Well, if we're talking about power, and I think we're taking a look at that now, is power is what we all run on, giving our power to somebody to represent us. And when those groups take power for the sake of power, and I think you're seeing that, and frankly, I think the power is corrupted by money. I think money in the system right now is at a level, it's back like it was around the turn of the century, where there's just so much money, and I'm sure everybody here is getting all the same things to donate to whatever. But money corrupts the system, and I think we've corrupted the system in a way that everybody's trying to hold on, and it all gets back to the issue is, how can I keep power? At what cost can I keep power? And it isn't what Clayton was talking about is the shared power. One of the reasons I left, well, I was 80, it was time to go. I swore I would never get woken up drooling on the desk. I had to go before that happened. But people were unwilling to compromise anymore or talk about compromise because it was the retention of power. And on a national level, it just takes so much money to do that to this day.
In my opinion, it's both, and it's a feedback loop, and it's hard to disentangle.
Yeah, I would agree with Dr. Johnson. That being said, as somebody who both sort of works in the spirit of designing collaborative processes and is often a participant in them, I would say around issues and the desire to get to durable outcomes, I would take a room full of passionate, fired up people who are maybe on its face full of conflict over the apathy, a room around people sitting on their hands and mouths and not willing to sort of engage. So, you know, I think that whether they are complex issues around public lands, and I'm involved in a collaborative in Southwest Montana trying to resolve some land designations in Beaverhead County, and was just in a meeting in Lima that was quite rambunctious, very strong feelings and emotions and sort of passion, and what some felt was a lot of conflict. Senator Wellborn, Jeff Wellborn, and I were both in the meeting and sort of walked away of like, that went really well. Because it felt like we had released the steam off of the kettle and that we had gotten to a richer discussion because we had sort of let the energy out of the room. So I am not somebody who thinks that we have to sort of mitigate or avoid conflict. I appreciate it because I think it pushes us to better, more durable compromises when people are passionate about issues. That being said, conflict is often a strategy. Same way that sort of like playing I don't know or I don't have an opinion is a strategy. Like these all can be parts of strategies, but that's my observation from sort of being in the field of some pretty hot meetings in the last few weeks.
Thank you. Can you, each one of you, draw an example from your own experience of which you're particularly proud of crafting consensus among people with strongly opposing views?
Well, I've got a lot of those but I'll go back to a union one rather than a political one, and sometimes when you're negotiating, you have to get to win, and I will just bring up one. And someone questioned me about what do you think about the dock strike, and I said, well, they were down to what usually the two issues left for the dock strike, or it was the wages and then automation taking over jobs. So they negotiated everything probably over the last number of months, and they went on strike and they went back to work because they got the wages. Now they'll have the other one that is going to be much tougher. But that's a current one. It's just you can look at that today. But so I'm down in Colstrip. We're negotiating the contract for 6 months for the miners at Colstrip in Colstrip, Montana. Got through all the issues, got through all the negotiations on hours and shifts and all the other things. Contract language that they wanted to take out, and we didn't want to. Anyway, it took about 6 months, and you'd brush over the wages once in a while, and finally you get down to the last week, and you're down to the wage issue, and And I said to the person there was a group we were negotiating with, got the head guy aside, and I says, you gotta give us this. And he wouldn't do it. So I went to the union guys and I said, hey, you're gonna have to strike. Well, boy, they got fired up, and I thought, wow, this is good. So I fired them up more, right? So they strike, we go on strike. So we go back to the negotiations, and I said, you gotta get, okay, we'll give you this, but you assure me you're gonna, oh yeah, you give us that much, and they'll accept the contract. Well, so I got the company, great deal, way more than, so I'm thrilled silly. Go back to the men, I had them so fired up, they said, hell no, we're gonna stay on the strike. Now you're stuck with a room to 300 miners that are all wound up, and you're going, oh, why did I do that to myself? Now I have to go back to the guy and eat crow. And I said, you've got to give us and he's livid now. He's telling me, wait a minute, you're the one who's going to get this done. This is what you promised me. And I said, I'm practically on my bended knee to this guy. You've got to give us a little something I can take back to him. And then I had to work with some other guys to actually bring him in. And the vote went, but it wasn't a unanimous vote either, because these guys were really fired up. So sometimes you can outsmart yourself doing this.
So, on a very sort of different note, in terms of higher education, we had the college I work at, we had a challenge over external speakers policy and public events policy. We needed to, we had to come up with a decision. People had very different opinions what should be on it. So Father Patrick and I were on this committee with others. And one thing is that, we had to make a decision. We wrote drafts, but we had to let everyone have a say. We didn't become defensive about our work. Have a say, take advice, try to adjust and incorporate people's ideas for a document to serve the whole. And I think it worked pretty well over what could be a very contentious. So people came with, good faith. The people who were actually writing the policy had to really be very careful and just not become defensive and just listen to people and see, how could we get something that would serve the whole community.
Yeah, I was very proud of that work with you, Dr. Johnson, and Dr. Gorica was with us also. Clay.
Yeah, I brought this up a little bit earlier, but since it's fresh on my mind, it's coming from Helena today, striking a deal on proposal for resolution to exempt wells, path forward on exempt wells, so water policy, sort of de minimis water use and the permitting process. I'm not going to bore you because we could spend another 4 hours talking about the underpinnings of this, but you have fierce property right interest. It's at the forefront of the housing development challenges of Montana and conservation and stream flow. So you have the very passionate and dynamic forces from the building and housing community, agriculture and senior water right holders, including Northwestern Energy and leagues of the cities and towns, conservation and recreation, tribal interests. A very complex negotiation that has taken about 16 months and difficult both from a science and technical standpoint, but also for managing human relationships in sort of entrenched positions. And today we were able to sort of take one big step forward and hopefully have a bill that will probably be eviscerated by the members of the legislature in about 2 weeks. But anyways, I'm very proud of bringing very competing interests that have really made an industry of fighting with each other together around the table to get to a potential resolution to a long-standing conflict.
All very encouraging. One last question, and I'm going to open it up to you. I just got from Southern California, where I spent a week, and 3 days in that week that I spent was the Pacific Air Show in Huntington Beach. It was a massive event with hundreds of thousands of people. And I made the observation there that was depressing to me, is that even though it was an event that had nothing to do with our current politics, they were the Harris sections and the Trump sections. And I said, my God, they cannot let that go even for 3 days to watch airplanes in the sky. So, and it was just so disturbing. And just putting that in your face, you know, when people like me, they were not wanting to think about that in those moments. So why do you think, up to this point, we have succeeded in avoiding those extremes here in Butte? And can we count on that to continue?
I think there's been extremes here in Butte, but this is from my own personal experience. I mean, when you take a look at how many people here worked in the early days, and at one time there were 15,000 men working underground here. And let me tell you something. When you're working underground, whether you're an Irishman and an Englishman, you're not the enemy anymore.
Yeah.
When you're a Serbian and a Croatian or an Italian and you're working underground, they're your partner. And I think that filtered out into this community, and and then when you grew up at the time that I grew up, you were out to play with everybody, and you were expected. There weren't all the cell phones. You were out to play. You stayed out of the house, and you had to play and learn to get along. And you didn't come home and tell what problems you had outside. You learned to get along. And people, while they came from other countries and immigrated to here, they had to work together to get the job done, no matter what they did. But when you're working close and you have a partner, doesn't matter what nationality, doesn't matter what religion anymore, because your life depends on each other, and the work that you're doing depends on each other. And I think that filtered out into the committee, whether you were delivering beer for the brewery or working for the baggage down at the baggage handlers. They were all different people, but and I think that's why the community actually got along together. We did have the neighborhoods, yes, but they actually, the community got along because, and then when someone died in the mine, everybody was here. The women took care of her and helped. If you go out to St. Patrick's Cemetery, there's a lot of widows who bought big headstones for the guys out there. And I think that translated into the community.
Yeah, Butte has an extraordinarily rich culture of sympathy and grief, and solidarity and grief that is extremely touching. Dr. Johnson?
I really like Jim's answer. That's the very best answer that anyone could possibly give to that question. So I'll answer it, but from a very different academic political science way, but his answer is the best. So political scientists can be very pessimistic sometimes. They'll argue that this is the United States, that our system of government, where you have first past the post elections, meaning that in single member districts, either a Republican or a Democrat or one person is going to win. You don't get a certain percent of seats in the legislature by just getting a certain percent of the vote. And you have a presidential system. Political scientists are sometimes skeptical about countries with those systems. And an argument that the United States has worked so well in the past is our political parties were not really that ideological. Our major parties, there used to be liberal Republicans, there used to be conservative Democrats, and if you looked in the legislature, some Republicans would be more conservative, there would be some more liberal than some Democrats, and vice versa. In the last several decades, that has vanished. The major political parties have become much more polarized ideologically than they were for most of American history. And because of that, that's a warning sign for some political scientists to watch out for this type of system. So I like Jim's answer the best, but that's the political science answer.
I would second Dr. Johnson and say that Jim has the best answer here. I can't offer the perspective from Butte, but I did grow up in a very small farming community in Wyoming, and I think that similar to Jim, I am still old enough to remember when you got kicked out of the house and told not to come home until it was dark, and you better figure out how you were going to get by, whether there was conflict or not. And I think in a rural farming community, the other notion, and I think this was true in Butte as well, is that you all relied on each other for anything that could come up in your community. If there was a natural disaster or an individual disaster, or somebody's combine broke down, the neighbors would pitch in. And I think that there was, at the time, even when I was growing up,
the sort of localization, it was hard to get help from outside. And so you had to turn to your neighbors, and it didn't matter who they voted for or who you voted for. In a time of crisis, people would show up at your door. I think that the sort of heterogeneous mixing of communities is probably changing, and Dr. Johnson could opine on this far greater than I could in terms of the greater mobilization of individuals kind of being able to self-select the communities that they want to live in, which I think is very different from the time even when I grew up, where you grew up and you learned to adapt to a community because that's the only community you had a choice to be a part of. And it was also, for me, it went back 3 generations in that same rural farming community. So you had the 3 generations of conflict, of course, but also 3 generations of relationship that came with it. I think that that's changing somewhat as we have greater mobilization and people get to self-select not only the information they want to see, but the communities and the neighborhood and the neighbors that they want to have to think more like. But I can, in a farming community sense, felt a lot like the Butte that Jim talks about growing up too. It didn't matter because you relied on everybody in times of good and in times of bad.
Thank you. 3 great answers from all of you. Absolutely.
To go back to history a little bit, and I was talking to Clayton about this, Butte is super instrumental, and this is where, in my mind, people do make a difference. Is if you go back when finally Clark got elected to the Senate after he was there on his final speech, Butte was real instrumental in finally the Forest Service putting people out into the forest, because what had happened for like 15 or 20 years in the Forest Service, both Clark and Daley were stripping every tree they could find off federal government land and not paying for anything, and they loved it. They had loggers out there, they had everything going. And one of the interesting things about Clark's final speech in the Senate, when he was leaving the Senate, and I'll paraphrase some of this, but the 2 things he was mad about, he was mad as heck about what Theodore Roosevelt had done for conservation. He was mad at Theodore Roosevelt, and he did a diatribe on Pinchot for the Forest Service, because now there would actually be people stopping them from stealing the trees. And then he had something for us. His close to last statement was, "I don't know what we're worried about. Let the people in the future take care of themselves." Now that's so I just there's something.
That's an interesting concept, yes, absolutely. I want to turn it to you, a comment, a question directed at any of us, or to all 3 of them, or all 4 of us. And I would appreciate if you could stand up and speak loudly for your comments so we can all hear you, and then you can sit down to receive the answer. Yeah, we'll start with you, Janet.
I'll kick things off. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So you've all sort of hinted at it. When I get together, we all get together and talk with our friends and families, one of the themes with respect to conflict is about how we get our information. And this is I'm sure you've all had this conversation at your respective dinner tables, but when, while it probably wasn't all the news, and there was probably some whitewashing going on when Walter Cronkite or Huntley Brinkley told us the news, we at least all shared in that experience, or we all opened our daily papers, and while we disagreed, we all were formulating our arguments based on at least a common set of information. And I would like to comment that I think the fact that we're all getting our information from different sources, it goes to what Jim was saying earlier about lying. We're not in general agreement about where we start, what the facts are. So I would suggest that's part of why this era may be different from some of our historical eras. But I would like to see if you have any thoughts about how we might overcome that problem of having our own set of information that fits with our values or our opinions, rather than sharing a common knowledge base upon which then we can collaborate, as Clayton has discussed.
You're absolutely correct. I have a whole class on that issue, exactly. I talk about Walter Cronkite, how you have start with a shared news source, and losing that really helps fuel polarization. Part of that is the decline of the media. There's the traditional media. Newspapers have declined, and that was one of the best sources for detailed information about policy. And we've seen a movement in politics to be more personality-based and less about policy, except often on very rudimentary levels. That is a real problem, a real challenge. I do think, organizations such as the Montana Free Press here in Montana, which people can read for free, is probably the next generation of trying to, and maybe people's blogs, where people can use tools. You still have to go find it, don't get me wrong, and maybe share on social media, but I think that's one of the most important critical things, especially the decline of the for-profit newspapers, that could be part of the answer. I think it has to be part of the answer for moving forwards. People politically often use heuristics, rules of thumbs, because things are complicated, to try to make sense of things. And at some level, though, you're not working from facts, if you're not working from evidence from the very beginning, or even sort of shared common values, it makes it very hard to find consensus or move beyond conflict.
And you first, Annette. So one thing that is really very dear to me, Janet, is exposure to diversity of opinion, particularly in higher education. I dread the concept of higher education, which is an installation of only reflecting one point of view, and by insulating yourself from other points of views, it makes you much, much less capable to navigate diversity of opinions in culture and in society. And I think much, much more likely to be a consumer of false statements or false or misguided statements or radicalized opinions about things. I think to be exposed to a diversity of opinion is extraordinarily important for the young people. Growing up in Paris, a lot of my teachers were communists, and we were very Catholic. My parents not once said, "Oh, my poor baby, I have to take you out of there and take you to a place where you're only going to hear about Catholic things." They knew that I was growing in that environment and become a lot more confident about my own beliefs as a result of that. And respectfully, they said to me, do not hesitate, very respectfully, to say that you don't agree with what he says if he's trying or she's trying to indoctrinate you. It was the best possible education for me. It's giving me a whole lot of self-confidence in expressing my opinions, and I think that's one of the great, great roles of higher education, is to expose people to diversity, but true diversity of thought, true diversity.
I think I'm on. One of my favorite statements came from Kellyanne Conway. Alternative facts. Now, how can you have alternative facts? Facts are facts, and there's no alternative facts. And I think we have to, in the environment we're in now, we have to really think about ourselves. And when we hear these things, or even have young people find out where they're talk to them, where you're getting the source of information. I have a couple younger people in their late 30s, and they tell me they don't do anything that I do, but I ask them the question, well, what information do you have? And then when they repeat it, then you can have a conversation. Well, I don't know. Is it right? Then once you get to that, I think you have to ask yourself, do I believe this? And where is this information coming from? I mean, if you look at the ads, I mean, they're just crazy. And if you do any fact checking on them, and Clayton can tell you this, in the legislature, they'll put an amendment in, and that's where they're getting all this stuff. They're taking Social Security, they're doing this, and somebody will put an amendment on there, and you vote on the amendment, and the whole thing is gonna die, but then they say, well, he voted on that, and it never happened. I mean, it's just, so what we're told now, by money, because they're dumping the money into this, and one of the scariest things for Montana, and I have to wait till after the election to check this out, but one of the things that I heard was for this Montana Senate election, that it will be the costliest election per vote in the history of the United States. Now, what? That's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate, first of all, because Jim Keane just referred to me as a young person. I feel much better. I kept trying to think of anyways, I appreciate that. I'm going to go home and sleep well tonight. But Janet, I think you bring up a great question, and it's something that I certainly struggle with too. And when you come to the table to try to have a conversation or negotiate an agreement, and everybody's coming from a different place, and many times that those are not accurate statements or beliefs or facts that are brought to the table. And I think that the sort of pessimism that I can get into about sort of the trend of a national or global sort of democratization of information, and feeling like there is less of an arbitrator of what is fact and what is fiction, and the alternative facts of coming in. I think I can get quite pessimistic, but to come full circle to what Jim talked about at the beginning is, nobody's gonna show up on the door, on your front step of your door and say, hey, here's what we agree on. It's on you to do the work. It's on you to understand where people are coming from, to build the relationships, to have the trust, to be able to challenge if there are inaccurate information that maybe somebody's believing. Because I have had in so many cases with people that we can really fundamentally disagree with on an issue, and after spending 6 months working through it, and I have a renewed ability to say, that's not very accurate. And it's because of the time and the investment and the relationship that you have built with somebody that you can have a more, and believe it, like they'll say the same thing to me, and there have been many times when I've been like, oh, well, I learned something today too. So I just think that it's incumbent on us to not get paralyzed by sort of this sort of doom and gloom of challenges of the national landscape. I think it's interesting to talk about that, but in our community and in our neighborhood and in our state, we have an opportunity to put in the work, to show up, to search out the relationships that we want to have to make a difference. And I think there's just so much that we can make a difference on here in our community and our state.
Yeah, well said. Please do not be victims of polarization. There's a lot that you can do within your own community. Who's next? Carroll.